70 feet tall, 350 tons, at least 6,700 years old, and it's toppled over. And I wonder who built them and why. And we've been all around Brittany, Hugh and I, and our friend Howard Crowhurst worked with archaeologists and went through old records. And he claims that at one point there was 50,000 standing stones in Brittany alone, which is astounding. Some of them 6,000 to 7,000 years old at least. So it's a really compelling place. It's like a forest of stones at Karnak. It's really, everything's supersized, so it's really fascinating. So we've also been Tenkuu and other ancient sites, and as a stonemason, what catches my eye is like these smooth planes. I work with a quarry. My friend owns a huge diamond saws, and they cut, you know, this hard stone. And I look at these things, and then I look in the museum, and I see the tools of the time, and I'm like, this really seems like you couldn't reproduce this. This is beyond my capability. So one of the episode ideas I have is get some incredible master masons and sculptors, give them the tools of the time and the stones, and see if they can do these interior cuts, you know, as a proof of whether this is some kind of technology that pre-existed. And when I see things, there's Brian Forrester, like this pillowing stonework in Cusco, it's astounding. It's not that you can't get a razor blade between it, you can't get a micron between these seams, and they're all flawless. It's I don't know, astonishing is the word I would say. And I'm just coming in as an independent stonemason. I got no axe to grind or theory to support. I'm just like, what, WTF, basically. Sacsayhuaman's another place. You go through every stone and just see this incredible artistry and skill. And here's a Coricancha in Cusco, a temple, and this requires planning. When you do cuts like this, when you do this kind of work, there's like a schematic. It's like a machine, a CNC machine made these things. And I know you're a savvy and open-minded crowd, so you've seen things like this in the past. But for me, as a mason, my first time there, I was astonished at all these sites. Even in Machu Picchu, you see the similar things. You see kind of run-of-the-mill construction that I could throw together. Then an earthquake separated this. And what you see is the stones aren't just joined on the seam. The entire thing is like curved, and all these stones are interlocking in the most wonderful fashion. So the entire stone is joined together like that. It's not just like the seam and it's loose behind it. So the thought and the planning and the attention to detail, once again, is astounding. Here's Machu Picchu. It's like, you know, I'm going to do this just because I can. You know, this is so hard to pull off. It really smacks of what Brian Forrester would say, a previous civilization. And actually, I like to point out that I'm glad Alan went before me, because I'm going to talk about the Sumerians. And a perceptual shift may answer the questions he had about a lost civilization, and we'll see if everything lines up. My son did all these fancy things with the slide. He's my tech guy. So this is Brian Forrester sent me this. This is a slide from the 50s, and it shows earthquake damage. And this Inca wall is built in front of this polygonal, tightly fit wall with these strange knobs you find all around the planet. And, you know, it really shows that there were two different levels of construction that took place here. And then you see the fits after the fact, right? It's kind of like random stonework to fit in, you know, after an earthquake or something like that. So you see several levels of repair that aren't as competent as the original builders. This is one of my favorite sites, Ollantaytambo. And these seams, this is hard stones, and the quarry is way over another mountain past the river. And not only moving the stones, but the flawless precision with which these are joined really begs the question, you know, were they built at the time archaeologists say they were built, and by the people that were attributed to their construction? Once again, these walls, they go in and interlock. Like, the plan, it just gives me a headache, is all I got to say as a stonemason, so I can't work with it too much. It's astounding. And this is my last example of stonework. You just see the flawless seams. And it's really something that, you know, begs the question, should we have archaeologists work with geologists, stonemason engineers to solve these problems? And I say yes. I don't always get a warm reception, but I believe, yeah, why not? You know, a multidisciplinary approach is what I look at. Like, when you go to the doctor and you get antibiotics and it saves your life, you're like, thank God. But if I'm going to take antibiotics, it's like a limited very useful. It doesn't solve our issue. the human history. I don't always get that's my contention anyways. And this guy, Edgar Casey, in his readings, probably said about the same thing that I just said. So Edgar Casey, he was the son of a minister born in Hawkinsville, Kentucky. So Casey had this strange gift. He would go in a trance-like state, and he would give health readings. And doctors would bring their patients who couldn't be helped, and he became very famous healing people, often with natural means, or mostly with natural means. So Casey would go into this trance-like state, and his source would tell him he was basically tapping into the Akashic records, the universal timeless records. And he started to give these strange accounts of past lives in Atlantis, in ancient Egypt. And the people, his sons, and the people who worked with him were fascinated. They kept asking questions about Atlantis. So what I'm going to do is do a comparative analysis of the Casey material with the Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, the Theosophists, Plato, religious documents, oral traditions around the world, and show that they're all saying the same bizarre and specific thing about the past. And this is what caught my attention. All these sources say that Atlantis existed in the middle of the Atlantic, that giants and little people were part of its population, that androgynous creator gods, or humans, that were basically sexless beings, birthed humanity. I know that sounds like I'm on magic mushrooms, but bear with me. It's really a strange thing, but you'll see in the iconography, you will see this displayed across the world in myth, legend, and in every other, approach. And it's just really fascinating, so bear with me, I will say. So Casey talked about Atlantis at length, but he wasn't the only one. That's what happened to Atlantis, supposedly. And, people want to know your opinion. After 30 years of this, basically, I'm sorry, this one? My gut, as a detective, who doesn't really have a lot of skin in the game, believes that what I'm going to lay out, this alternative view of history, is accurate, or predominantly accurate. And in 50 or 100 years, I think the version that I tell you will be accepted more as reality than what we have presently. And I'm not some big hero. I'm just doing a comparative analysis of pre-existing evidence. I'm just piecing it together. So I'm not trying to make a grand theory. I'm just, I want to display to people these interesting things that I find. So in one of Casey's readings, this is what he says. Please give a few details regarding the physiognomy, habits, customs, and costumes of the people of Atlantis during the first period just before the first destruction. So this is what Casey says. They took on many sizes at stature, from that, as may be called, the midgets, to the giants, for there were giants in the earth in those days, men as tall as what would be termed today 10 or 12 feet in stature, and well proportioned throughout. So we all know Plato, what he had to say about Atlantis. The primary ancient source for the legend of Atlantis was Plato. And skeptics say Plato's the only one who talked about Atlantis, then everybody just picked up on it. But the honest truth is Herodotus, who was born before Atlantis, before Plato, also talked about Atlantis. This is what he said. Herodotus, the father of history. Near the Salt Hill is a mountain named Atlas. After this mountain, these received their name, for they are called the Atlanteans. And he also refers to the sea beyond the pillars of Heracles as the Sea of Atlantis. So he spoke specifically about Atlantis before Plato was born. So Diodorus, this is what he says. The Atlantides inhabited a rich country bordering upon the ocean, and were esteemed to excel all their neighbors in civil reception and entertainment of strangers, and they boast that the gods were born among them. This is the place all the Greeks and the Romans believed was the land of the Titans, the Mount Olympus. They are referring to Atlantis. This is an alien. In a word, this island is so delightful that it appears to be the abode of the gods rather than of human beings. That's an alien right there. So, Theopompus relates the particulars of an interview between Midas, king of Phrygia, and Selenius. This is very interesting. Selenius told Midas, Europe, Asia, and Libya are islands washed on all their shores by the ocean, and there is but one continent which is situated outside these limits. Its expanse is immense, It produced very large animals and people twice as tall as was common to our climate, and they lived twice as long. That's another thing, that the first humans were the spirit beings who were entrapped in physical bodies. That's what all these sources are saying. Evolution is a reality, we know that, but the creation of Homo sapiens seems to be a supernatural event. All these sources are saying. So I must concede that there is a supernatural aspect to what I'm saying. So science has a problem with it, but just see what you think. And then the nature of animals. Those living near the ocean tell the tale that the ancient Atlantean kings, tracing their lineage from Neptune, wore bands made from the sea rams upon their heads. So it's clear all these great chroniclers are talking about Atlantis. Now we have Rudolf Steiner, whose spirit is probably with us right here. He says, everything that refers to giants in the legends is absolutely based on knowledge of the truth. We feel it to be absolutely correct from the spiritual scientific point of view that the giants are stupid and the dwarfs are very clever. And Hugh in his talk,
this shit, man.
That there was this malevolent race of giants that was created that was particularly dull and malevolent and cannibalistic. And you find it Native American, I sit in ceremonies with Native American spiritual leaders all the time, and they tell me these same things. And they always talk about the little people too. It's really incredible. And I have a doctor I see that escaped from Vietnam. He does Chinese herbal medicine. His culture always talks about the little people in Vietnam. It's really incredible. So the Rosicrucian Fellowship. There are two prime facts that stand out. One is that there were giants in the earth in those days. The other, that the patriarchs lived for centuries. Long-lived patriarchs. And this is the Rosicrucian Fellowship. And this is a full digest that was devoted to Atlantis. This is to show you that the Rosicrucians and the Freemasons have this as part of their philosophy. In this issue, we explore the mysteries of the lost continent of Atlantis, one of the most powerful and enduring ideas of the Western world and of Rosicrucian heritage. Rosicrucian science confirmed. An 8-foot skeleton there. It's in our book. This is one of the ones that was shipped to the Smithsonian, which has this nefarious, the Smithsonian is now some dark place like the Vatican, and I don't want to promulgate that. I will talk about my belief in academic conspiracies in a while. So this is from a Rosicrucian publication. We followed it up on the show, actually, in the cave that this was found and was flooded. But these enormous skulls were found, almost 10 feet tall. They don't have specific femur measurements, but it's a pretty wild story. So the Rosicrucians and the Freemasons are definitely involved in the belief that giants existed. Manly P. Hall, one of the greatest thinkers in Freemason history, Atlantis and the Gods of Antiquity is a full chapter in his book. Madame Blavatsky, the same thing. She talks about androgynous beings, giants, little people, Atlantis existing, the Great Flood. In the Bible, there's 26 mentions of giants, pretty specific. Here's one of them in Deuteronomy. A people great and tall, the sons of the Anakim, who you know and of whom you have heard it said, who could stand before the sons of Anak. And here's Flavius Josephus. In Hebron, there were till then left the race of giants who had bodies so large and countenances so entirely different from other men that they were surprising to the sight and terrible to the hearing. The bones of these men are shown to this very day, unlike the credible relations of other men. So Hugh and I, in our investigations, team with Ross Hamilton, Micah Ewers, and other researchers, and we've essentially found over 1,000 accounts in the United States of 7-foot and taller skeletons, oftentimes by respected academics, heads of anthropology and archaeology departments in the U.S. And it's pretty straightforward. You have accounts in the New York Times, 9-foot tall, enormous skull, and they describe the Native American context, the specific burials, like seated facing the east or like spokes of a whale. So these unique burial patterns wouldn't be understood by a hoaxer. These are clearly legitimate reports of a stationary object. Quite frankly, the skeleton doesn't get up and run around. When a femur is measured at 29 inches, that's an over 8-foot skeleton. Over and over again, you have this by respected individuals. So this isn't a subjective thing. This is just anatomical measurements. 9-foot tall, jawbone over the face. These specific accounts you find embedded and lost essentially in town and county histories, obscurely buried page 500-600, describing the same strange anatomic anomalies in an era of inefficient communication. as a detective, that just puts up a red flag. Like, what the hell is going on? This isn't a hoax. You know, these are anatomical measurements that, you know, should be straightforward. So at the Chickasaw Mound in Arkansas, you have this account from the Field Museum in Chicago. They have like the big, who's the Sioux, the big T-Rex. They're a well-known institution. This is from one of their archaeologists down there. The skeletons are very large and tall. One femur bone was unearthed that was 29 inches in length. The skulls are extremely large. The jaw is such size that it would slip over my own and have considerable space to spare. There's over 100 bones that we found, and some of them are, the skeleton was wired together, the town was abuzz. The largest man in town took the jawbone, whiskers and all, put it over his face and had room for his hands. So when you're dealing with an enormous skeleton, you're not dealing with, you know, pituitary gigantism. There's so many of these cases. You're dealing with just enormous skeletons over and over again, and it's stunning. You know, we talk about in our book, you know, where are the skeletons and things like that. It's kind of frustrating, but I think you'll see that it's really compelling. W.J. Holland, very
Smoke time.
skeleton. This is a Scientific American right here. He works for the Carnegie, so that was unearthed there. In Miamisburg in Ohio, right? We have this
Shit is dog.
Of the Smithsonian's anthropology.
It's alright. Bear with me, everybody.
Thomas W. Wilson. This is what he says. First of all, it's 8 foot 1.5 inches. There's a drawing of it. Anthropologists from all over the world are there. They're stunned. They list them, the skeleton with the largest giants of all time. And Wilson says this: the authenticity of the skull is beyond doubt. Its antiquity is unquestionably great. To my own personal knowledge, several such crania were discovered in the Hopewell group of mounds in Ohio. Pretty straightforward stuff, you know. Then Edgar Casey, which is, I think, fascinating. This guy had an 8th grade education. All he did was read the Bible. He was deeply offended by some of his own readings because he was so, you know, hardcore Christian. But he had 68 readings on the mound builders. And the mound builders is a fascinating group of civilizations that started around 500 BC, maybe 1000 BC. The Adena, Hopewell, and Mississippian people inhabited the eastern half of the United States, and they built massive pyramids in geometric forms. Like Cahokia, the Mississippians built this in Collinsville, Collinsville, Illinois. Grave Creek in West Virginia, 68 feet high. These massive constructions. There was a male and a female, 7 foot and 8 foot tall, listed in the archaeological record. These geometric forms that could predict eclipses, like the circle and octagon. Very, very extraordinary mathematics and geometry. They understood the metonic cycle of the moon, the 18.61 cycle of the moon. Very high-minded stuff going on in ancient America. So yeah, there's a golf course that is part of Newark now, but this is what it looks like from an aerial shot, or what it would fully have looked like. So there's incredibly complex forms. And what Casey said about the mound builders is that they came up to avoid the death cults in Mesoamerica, all the human sacrifices, and they were benevolently oriented. And they created a lot of these geometric forms as a ceremonial site to remember Atlantis, which sounds bizarre. But then you go to Portsmouth, Ohio. This is gone, but it was surveyed. And there are many forms like this, like Circleville, Ohio. And check it out, it's just like Plato's Central City of Atlantis. My buddy Greg Little in the book Mound Builders points this out. And archaeologists can never figure out why there's moats everywhere, you know, and ditches and things like that. Even on the side of the Atlantic, you have the similar forms. So in the Smithsonian's own ethnology reports, there are 17 accounts of 7 foot and taller skeletons. One of my favorites here is from the 1873. This account. T.M. Perrin's Smithsonian Archaeologist reports, the skulls are very large, but fall to pieces on being exposed to the air. One skull was found that measured 36 inches in circumference. That is absolutely enormous, well out of human range. And there are a lot of accounts that you and I just encountered just like this. Specific measurements, just listed, you know, anonymously in some lost document. It's not jumping out. It's not headline grabbing. They're not mastodon bones or hoaxes. You know, there's some mixed in, but not these. So, you know, what is going on here? You know, and a lot of people think, you know, there's some vast conspiracy. And I work with professionals, and I'm friends with archaeologists, geologists, and, you know, we have discussions. They don't always agree with me, but we have civil discourse. that's not always the case. One of the things is, you know, I don't believe in academic conspiracies. You couldn't pull it off anyways. And it's not like, you know, whatever. It's not like Enron. It's just a bunch of men and women doing what they think is their job. And I don't want to disparage anyone. I just want to point to, you're indoctrinated into a way of thinking and you stick with it. It is just the ego. And here's a perfect example. This is Robert Sharp and John Anthony West. This is Geology 101, the weathering at the Sphinx. This is clearly weathered by water. It's incontrovertible, right? But this idea comes up when you have Mark Lerner and Zawi Hawass, Egyptologists. They attack Robert Sharp and the whole idea. Geologists firmly agree. I agree. I'm pretty well versed in geology. That is weathered. There's no question about it. So that dates the Sphinx back to, 7, 8, 10,000 years. But just the thought, like, I can't accept this because it doesn't fit what I've been working on, for all these years. So you get an arrogant, dismissive, person like Zawi Hawass who doesn't say, that's interesting, let's investigate more. He acts like a petulant child and he just, insults everyone. And there was, a couple days ago, a new shaft or chamber was found in the Great Pyramid of Giza, right? And we don't know all about it, but the crew that did it, they kept Egyptologists out of it to remain impartial. So Zawi Hawass is quoted, and he insulted him. He's totally arrogant and dismissive. It's like, how about, that's interesting. Maybe there's another shaft in the Great Pyramid. Let's see what the science reveals. But it's that ego orientation that dismisses, just like Alan was saying. I'm pointing to a lost civilization that would answer maybe Alan's questions. And, I found it fascinating, right? He just laid out hard science and math, incontrovertible. But no way, that means there's a lost civilization that existed with Solutreans and Clovis people that was very advanced, that maybe lived in the middle of the Atlantic. And they passed that knowledge on after a great flood. No, I don't believe in the Bible, that's all crazy stuff. And I'm not religious, I'm a recovering Catholic. But I think the Bible's an important document. I think it was altered, and I think there's distortion in it, but it is another important document to look at. So I try to balance both worlds and not, just dismiss anything. So anyways, to go on with giants, all the early explorers you can name, Magellan, Drake, John Smith, Lawson, Coronado, they all documented encounters with enormous native chiefs, over 7 feet tall, over 8 foot tall, sometimes 9 foot tall, like in Mexico. And they specifically talk about the measurements, which is really astounding because the mainstream argument is that the Spanish were 5'2", and the natives were like 5'8" or 5'10". So they consider them giants, which just truly isn't the case. And in Patagonia, we have some pretty clear evidence of this right here. Drake, Magellan, as you were saying, for hundreds of years they encountered these enormous people. So Cook was 6 feet tall, and these people were pushing 7 feet that he met. It's really interesting here, though. Cook writes this. He claimed the Ona tribe he met in 1897 were from 6 to 7.5 feet tall. They wore animal skins, had horse strength and bull strength, and lived in simple wigwam huts made of tree branches. This really points to some anthropological curveball, the enormity of these people. This woman's 6'6". Cook took a picture of her. Looks like this is the old giant thing right here. This guy's 7'2", just enormous. 7'4", another guy. So he photographed these people, and this tribe was decimated by the English, unfortunately, like so many other tragedies that buried our past. We burned the Library of Alexandria as a species. We destroyed the Mayan codices. We basically just threw ourselves back to the Stone Age. And anthropology and archaeology were created in the late 1800s, frankly, and they started from scratch. They pushed away 10,000 years of oral traditions and the accounts of religious documents. So they started from Darwin, they started from scratch, and that's why we're in the bind that we are, where we don't understand our past. So here's one cool report. So DeSoto's secretary says this: the new lands they explored were ruled by the giant Native American chief Tuscaloosa. So he writes, seeing him, we paused, dumb with amazement, for though but a youth, he towered on high, a great-limbed giant, heads of tallest men reached only to his breast. So these are the accounts over and over again, and they specifically talk about 7-foot and 8-foot giants. You don't want too many giants on the brain. You gotta switch gears. So this is cool. It's called the Codex Vaticano, and these Toltec people are killing this giant in the mountains of Mexico. So I'm going to shift gears to, there's a Bible quote, and there was yet a battle in Gath, where was a man of great stature, and on every hand 6 fingers, and on every foot 6 toes, 24 in number, and he was also born to this giant. So that's pretty specific. So what are they talking about in the Bible? 6 fingers and 6 toes. What does it mean? Thomas Henry Buckle in 1872 writes this: commentators have collected various instances of men who, like this giant, have 6 fingers on their hands and 6 toes on their feet. This is what Edgar Casey said in the reading. He describes Muzuin, who traveled to the Gobi Desert, where he says there's a lost city of gold, from the lost Pacific continent of Lemuria in 926 BC, as being 6 foot tall, blue-eyed, hair dark gold, hand 6-fingered. Now that seems strange, and like how do you verify that? But there are other accounts. Pliny the Elder said the encounter between the Romans and the Seres, which they call the Chinese, and Taprobane, they exceeded the ordinary human height, had flaxen hair and blue eyes, and made an uncouth sort of noise by the way of talking. So what you have are these Taron Basin mummies that were found also, Caucasoid mummies, between 6 feet and 6 feet 6 inches. So they have blonde hair, blue eyes, red hair. It's really a fascinating corroboration of what Casey said years before in a trance-like state. And he talks about 6 fingers, which you find all around the world. In Utah, enormous feet, 6 fingers. This guy right here, this is from John Q. Jacobs. I haven't been to this site, but he has. He's a brilliant researcher. So this guy has nice feet. He has 6 fingers, enormous feet, 6 toes. Chaco Canyon, going up the side, 6 toes. This is from Illinois, Morse's Geographic Journal, 1838. Sorry, I'm trying to remember everything here. Giant foot right there, petroglyph with 6 toes, once again. All around the U.S., all around the world. This is a Chinese cave, the Buddha, 6 fingers on his hands. And we'll get into more of what this means. Casey would say, the mystics would say, it is a trait of the first humans, of giants and people that were of a higher spiritual state that essentially created Homo sapiens. And we are the prototype with 5 and 5, smaller, 5'6" to 6 foot tall, or whatever our height is. We are the prototype for humans to exist right now. That's what the mystics would say. And that the giants died off eventually. This is 100 AD, a shroud, Egyptian shroud. I'm sorry, 12 toes. This is very interesting. Ayin Ghazal, some of the oldest statues in the world, 8250 BC in Jordan. Just like the site at Jericho, they found these statues, 6 toes. And the author of this report, Arid Ziffer, he writes that he believes these are representations of the first, like the deities. We call these people gods, or the ancient ones call these people gods, with 6 fingers and toes. And he wonders if they're the Rephaim of the Bible. Very interesting. A lot of academics got into this idea of 6 fingers and toes independently. And they wrote these really interesting things, like it's never been picked up that there were so many of these figurines from Cyprus that have 6 fingers and toes. Things like that, really specific, but they're working in a vacuum. This isn't a well-known thing, and it's not collaborated on because it's kind of weird, 6 fingers and 6 toes. I'm not getting into a Bible quote, things like that. So clearly this guy, Brian Forrester, gave me this in the Peru Museum, 6 fingers on each side. This is quite strange right here. This, they found this bronze idol in, I think, 4000 BC in Kiev, and he has 6 fingers, and he's got the space boots on, so I don't know if he has 6 toes, but that's real. That's not like a fake artifact that you see on Facebook sometimes. That is a real find in Kiev. The Germans in 1938, they were probably searching for Atlantis under Himmler's orders. They went to Tibet and they found this axatite meteoric iron statue. It has the swastika there, and this guy has 6 fingers on each hand. It's really just stunning how you find it all over the world in isolated places. Palenque, where we're going on our tour, one of my favorite places. All over the place you find 6 fingers and 6 toes. This is Malik in Iran. I think it's 1800 BC. Most of the figurines have 6 toes. It's really fascinating. I think I'm sexually repressed, so too many of these slides. Yeah, it's just really astounding how many of these, it's very specific, right? It's not like, it's really jumping out at me anyways. This is interesting because a lot of these figurines are like, you'll see as I get into it, they're angelic or winged beings. And this is from Olympia in Greece. And all around the Middle East, from Turkey to Greece to Italy to other places, they had these sirens that were cauldron holders. And they had 6 fingers on each hand. Many of them did. Some had 5. They're very odd, but they were like these winged beings. And I will get into what Casey talks about. He actually, in many of these sources, talk about basically hybrids being created in the past in ancient Atlantis. Basically, all the myths and legends we have about minotaurs and centaurs, they say it was a reality. This genetic miscreation, this zoological nightmare. So this guy has 6 fingers on his hand, which is just another odd coincidence, if you will. This is in Cyprus, 3000 BC, quite old. And most of these figurines made of limestone have 6 toes. These isolated islands everywhere, same thing. This hunter at Cyprus, he had 6 toes. This Mayan idol here, he has 6 hands, and the little guy inside, 6 fingers, has 6 fingers as well. I think that's really funny. 1300 BC, Egyptian coffin lid, 6 fingers. Hugh talked about this. I can't verify this, but it's not like the Cardiff giant. It was never proven to be a hoax. It just disappeared. He has 6 toes, which is odd, 12 foot high. Austral Island, isolated Pacific island, at the Gauguin Museum outside. This guy, you can count him, 6 fingers. Isolated Pacific islands all around the world, the same thing. Right here, Kiribati, my buddy Eric Von Daniken went here. That giant footprint has 6 toes in it. And this old man is standing there, and there's giant graves and legends, just incredible, like everywhere else, that has 6 toes. It's, when you see it, it's clear and obvious. And then we go to Easter Island, and from, I just found this account. I didn't even know it existed here. You know, all the statues, the incredible stonework there, but there are petroglyphs with 6 toes on Easter Island. And this is from George Lee's book, The Rock Art of Easter Island. In Hawaii, there's also petroglyphs of 6 toes. So it just really, you know, when you have cases say it in the Bible saying it's associated with giants, and you talk to indigenous people and they say these same things, it's really interesting. And it's in the collective imagination. This is Jan von Scorel, 1540. Adam, the original biblical Adam, was an androgynous being. The story of Adam and Eve was like a recreation of the original. That's what the mystics say. So Adam here has 6 fingers. It's associated with supernatural gods and androgynous beings. That's the case I'm making. And when you go over to Egypt at the temple of Esna, you have Kahum, who helped make humans out of clay. And you have these legends and myths and you know, sites like this, I'll show you in a minute, that show humans being made, you know, out of clay, essentially, birthed from androgynous beings. This temple was made for an androgynous, anonymous god. Kahum was androgynous. At the temple of Esna, he had 6 fingers on his hands. So, this is where it gets strange. I used to try to be fake credible and stick with archaeology and stonemasonry and dating ancient sites, and I just said, the hell with it. I got to go with my intuition. You know, I got to give my honest opinion about what I feel. And whatever happens, you know, I'm scorned and ridiculed in some circles, and I just got to live with it because my gut as a detective tells me just investigate all these different angles, even the weird stuff like androgynous creator gods. You know, how do you make people without the right equipment? You know, what does it even mean? So, a primitive mind does not invent myths; it experiences them. You know, all the comparative mythologists, I would say, are on the same page for the most part with this idea. So this is Casey's biographer, one of them, W.H. Church. In the early days of Milius's rule, this is way back in Atlantis, he's saying, the separation of the sexes had not yet begun to take place. Though male in their outward aspect, the androgynous sons of God embodied within them the nature of both male and female in one person. Now that you see that in hermaphrodites today, that, you know, there's this aspect of, you know, positive and negative within, you know, every human, the ability to be male or female. And by turning to the creative forces, they could become channels to bring into being androgynous progeny after their own kind, imbued with a double soul and a double sex body. In this way, sexual intercourse was unnecessary as a means of propagation. Now, that doesn't sound too fun, but all these other sources are saying the same thing. In the Babylonian expedition, Hilbert says this: the androgynous nature, this ability to beget out of himself, his own ego. This self-existence is inherent in each and every god of the Sumerians. All Sumerian gods are androgynous. Then we have this guy who shows up after the flood with his man bag. His name is Oannes, and he spread wisdom and mathematics, and we will get back to him. He was androgynous, also known as Dagon. You see the beard and the breasts, the representation of his androgynous nature. He showed up after the great flood, and they say he was a hybrid creature who would go sleep in the ocean at night. And just stick with me, it sounds weird. You go on the other side of the Atlantic, and at the Olmec side of La Venta, you have Quetzalcoatl with the man bag, and he was born of an androgynous father being Ometeotl. So he is an androgynous demigod who showed up after the flood, rocking this crazy man bag and sharing wisdom with everyone. So these cultures were not supposed to be connected. It's very odd. And Viracocha, who's right down here, he's rocking the God Self icon, and I will get into him as well. He showed up after the flood. He is the androgynous creator god in Peru. But it's very specific in the text. This isn't some ethereal idea. This is what he said. At the top of the cosmological order was the androgynous divinity, Viracocha. Pachacuti Yamqui leaves no doubt as to Viracocha's sexual duality. For above his, her image are the inscribed words, whether it be male, whether it be female, ideologies and class in Inca and Peru, not Peru, a wonderful book. Another book, The Andes by Jason Wilson. Inti, the sun god, was himself issued from Viracocha, the androgynous creator at the center of the Peruvian religious culture for 2,000 years. Whether he was androgynous or not, all these sources are very specific about it. Plato in his Symposium. Aristophanes displays knowledge of an ancient myth of the androgen, according to which our original nature was by no means the same as it is now. When the androgen was split into two halves, the distinct male and female sexes were created. So Plato was talking about this. And Plato was talking about Atlantis, and Plato was talking about the Great Flood. And it's just fascinating how this guy with an 8th grade education in a trance state is really lining up with all these unrelated sources. It's really fascinating. Reference to a race of androgens which once inhabited the world occur in the midst of both East and West. In the Western tradition, this primordial androgen is to be found in the writings of certain of the Kabbalists, Gnostics, Neoplatonists, Swedenborgians, and Theosophists. In the Rosicrucian Fellowship, mankind was male and female before being separated into two distinct sexes, as man and women. During the period when man was thus constituted, fertilization must have occurred within himself, nor is this any stranger than that many plants are so fertilized today. I apologize for throwing so much at you, but I'm really trying to make this case that all these sources are saying the same specific and strange thing. So Steiner, he describes the point in evolution at which human beings split from being androgynous and single-sexed to becoming male-female. And the entire world is littered with androgynous deities. Native Americans, Zunis, the Aboriginals of Australia. It's just stunning. Everybody has an androgynous creator god, which I would say is not a creator god. It's more of a different kind of evolved human. And we've devolved into what we are now, kind of a warring, separate race of humans that's hopefully waking up from a nightmare. And that's what all the mystics are trying to do, is to wake us up to our real nature. And the Freemasons and the Rosicrucians said the same thing, and they carry this information and iconography through the Dark Ages, the androgynous nature of our being, our God self, if you will. So you see this iconography everywhere. Even the Templars, this is like, oh, it's Satan. No, it's the duality of different forces. There are breasts and the goat head. This is the androgynous aspect of human. And it's crafted in a way that the unconscious mind can understand what's being said. It's not like, oh, that's a goat person. There was a higher meaning in these symbols by the secret societies, which I spent a lot of time studying, the works of the Rosicrucians and Freemasons. So we see the symbolism. This is really interesting. This is Johannes Richter wrote this book called Sky God Deus. These are all unrelated people, and they're saying the related things. It is hard to believe that people have already been devoted to a singular androgynous deity 20,000 years ago, but the Paleolithic sculptures are quite explicit. Many multi-headed sculptures have been found, and one of the oldest identifiable sculptures made of ivory of mammoth and found at Gagarin, Ukraine, is claimed to be 22,000 years old. So this androgynous representation is joined at the head. And another academic, this is Ziffer. He explores the idea of androgynous created deities in the first Adam, androgyny, in the Ayin Ghazal two-headed bus. A very interesting scientific paper. So Ziffer says that the two-headed bus are a representation of the androgynous being. And they occur at Ayin Ghazal, 8250 BC. So some of the oldest statues in the world are remembering this androgynous race. 6 fingers and toes, 2 heads. He even starts to talk about Göbekli Tepe, and this is like a really well-respected academic, that they might be, the T-shaped pillars might be showing this androgynous nature. So I'm very anxious to see further digging at Göbekli Tepe as well. And here it is 6 toes, 2-headed, these created deities are being worshipped as an ancestor cult by some of the oldest, societies to have statues. And there's the 6 toes right there. I would like to, this is what Ziffer says, I would like to suggest that these statues represented mythical ancestors from the dawn of mankind, and that the 2-headed busts among them represent the first human being, the androgynous prototype of humanity. So you see these 2-headed busts everywhere. I think this is from Turkey, 2-headed busts. Janus, the Romans, the Greeks, everybody had the androgynous gods. It's really fascinating. Here's Kahum, the androgynous creator, crafting humans out of clay. And here's Thoth, the Atlantean king who showed up after the flood, who is androgynous, ibis-headed, and he's dealing with the ram-headed Kahum. And these beings are known to be androgynous, or at least that is the legend. He's writing down the years that this person's going to live. Hope he gives him a couple more. And once again, here is Oannes, or Dagon, the androgynous being who showed up after the flood. Here's the Australian Aboriginal deity. It's a long name I can't pronounce. So the world is littered with these androgynous deities. Boa Island in Ireland, the male and female, both sides of the statue, both heads. So obviously, it's tough to convey the androgynous aspects in a sculpture. So you have breasts and a penis or 2 heads. These things show up everywhere. This is what Casey said. This is where it gets weird if you thought it wasn't weird already. Many of these hybrid creatures of mythology, such as the satyrs, centaurs, and the like, are said by Casey to have inhabited the earth from the early days of progeneration in Atlantis. They were known as the Things. Casey talks about the sons and daughters of the law of one, of light, having a battle with these people called the sons of Belial, the ones who turned sacrifice into like human sacrifice. Casey says that you would build altars to sacrifice your separate self, the false self. You would get rid of hate and judgment, and you would have ceremonies that dispelled that had nothing to do with sacrifice. And these dark, selfish forces took over, and we see them in the world today. There are clearly people oriented to selfish, malevolent behavior, and there are people like this crowd who are oriented for the good of all. So that split existed, Casey says. And the sons of Belial created these things, if you will, to work in the fields, And some people say this is like the Bigfoot creature, intelligent but trapped in an animalistic body. So make of it what you will, but there's more support for this idea. Casey said that the Atlanteans founded Egypt, and they created temples where they would surgically help these beings who had like half goat, half man. And I know it sounds strange, but hang on. So all around Egypt, you find these different chimera everywhere. And oddly enough, you also find, which I find interesting, is this, it's more like a creature of Greek mythology. So check this out. Berosus tells us Oannes, the fish god who shows up after the flood, he was the benevolent being who brought mathematics and everything else. This is what he says, and this great chronicle wrote it down. In ancient times, when there was nothing but darkness and water, strange creatures were formed in the fluid, including men born with 2 wings and some with 4 wings, and 2 faces, and had 1 body and 2 heads. And they were both masculine and feminine, and they had 2 sets of sexual organs, male and female. This is what this fish being who showed up with the man-dag is saying, and here he is right here. So 500 years later, Eusebius of Caesarea says the same thing, essentially. And they produce double-winged beings, and more people with legs of goats and horns on their heads, and others cloven hoofs, and more with horse bodies and human torsos. They also wrought bull-headed men and even other monsters, whose images remain in the temple of Belos, one next to the other. And here you go right here. You have goat people and these winged beings. All the specific crazy creatures are represented all over the place, all throughout the world, once again. And this is a Sumerian demon with the four wings. This is from Sumeria as well. So you look at these people, like the Sumerians were off the charts as a civilization. Were they really like delusional and they made up all these weird, winged beings and gods? It just seems irrational for such an intelligent people. Then you get to the Maya and the Inca and the Native Americans. And once again, I've sat with elders and said, these people have their shit together. You know what I mean? It's really pretty obvious that they're tapped into something that is true. So right here, you have this winged being again. And he is embodying the God Self icon, which I will get back to. It's another fascinating, coincidental aspect of this whole thing. So we're still in the sales. You just see these weird beings, Is Casey right? Is Eusebius and Barossus right? Or Ants, are they right? Because I always wondered, like science answers none of these questions. But this alternate, strange view of history that is agreed upon by all these different unrelated sources answers all of these strange questions of lost worlds, missing legends. It explains the crazy stonework around the world. It explains how civilizations can spring up overnight so sophisticated, and why there is similar iconography all around the world. This version explains it. That's why it's very compelling to me. Why are you going to spend all your time creating goat beings and these winged creatures that are specifically talked about, like Barossus, four wings, and these beings have man bags once again, right? And then this Mayan god on the other side of the Atlantic, he has wings and he has a man bag, right? Another winged being, like I said, these cauldron holders. This is from the early 1900s. I believe this is in the collective imagination of people. That's why it lingers. That's why this fascination with minotaurs and these other beings. The four Morians, they showed up in Ireland and they fought Kukulcane, who had 7 fingers. And you can find that in Wikipedia. This golden god from Atlantis, who fought the evil Baelor from the sons of Belial. So this guy was a real a-hole, and he brought with him this zoological nightmare of all these beings. I like the fish guy. But it's embedded in myth and legend everywhere. It's just fascinating. Like Hugh says, everywhere you go, you get the same myths and legends. You talk to some elder in some Pacific island, and he's telling me the same thing that this Native American, Lakota chief told me. It's like, what is going on, Thank you. So back to what Casey said. So this minotaur, this creature, has 6 fingers. Just another specific alignment of these seemingly disparate ideas. So Casey talked about the sons of Belial, the sons of darkness. He talks about Belial over and over again, being this leader in Atlantis who went to war and destroyed basically the civilization. And the last destruction was 12,000 years ago. And we know from hard science that the Younger Dryas impacts that hit the ice sheet in the United States basically caused this great flood and this cataclysm that has been denied by science and for so many years. We know it is solid evidence now. So Casey is pointing this event 12,000 years ago. So after he dies in Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls are found, and a large number of references to Belial are evidenced in the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is after Casey's long dead. In the war of the Sons of Light against the Sons of Darkness, one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, Belial, is the leader of the Sons of Darkness. So this dude in with an 8th grade education in a trance state is basically saying what was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls years after. And he also said that there were women in the Order of the Essenes, which was not accepted by academics at the time. And then the Dead Sea Scrolls say that there were women in the ranks of the Essenes. So Casey was prophetic in many of these accounts. And it's just astonishing how he lines up. He'll say something, and then you'll see bizarre creatures with 6 fingers and toes on the temple wall. He could have had a team of 100 scientists and could not come up with a better con job if that's what it were. That's all I'm saying. So as a detective, if you're looking into a case, you want to look at all these different angles, and you don't want to be fooled by coincidence. You look past that. So for as long as humans have been telling stories, there has been a fascination with the idea of creatures who are half human and half animal. The strength of this archetype can be seen in the persistence of modern tales of werewolves, vampires, Jekyll and Hyde, and a host of other monster horror characters. Why is this in our collective imagination? Why is Atlantis and a lost world and ancient technology? We just can't get it out. Not only is it myth and legend and oral tradition, it is just in the popular culture. It's just fascinating. And I talk to a lot of academics and a lot of skeptics, they run their mouth about like, oh, you just want to believe in a lost world because you can't deal with the regular world, things like that. And I'm like, no, wrong. My intuition, and many people's intuition, is pointing to this idea of a lost world. That's why people are fascinated with Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings. And the gradualists and the uniformitarianisms, their minds can't handle the enormity of the true story of human civilization. So they hide in these academic realities where everything is nice and slow. I would say you people are the brave and the courageous ones who can think open-mindedly. And I don't want to disparage. I'm just saying that is a small way of thinking. That's bad science, too, to not incorporate every different, angle or avenue of evidence you can follow. So I believe that these things are in our collective consciousness for a reason. Whoa. So, in an effort to unravel the history of the past, I've sat in many ceremonies, ayahuasca ceremonies with shamans and medicine men, and I've heard versions of reality and I've experienced versions of reality that are wild, that are incredible, that are multidimensional, and it's not some drug trip. You deal with, the horror of the pain of the world. You deal with deep psychological, seated stuff comes up, very challenging. Sitting for 12 days in meditation and ceremonies. And the friends, my shaman friends, just give this brilliant alternative history of the world that has an alignment with what I'm saying. And this happens in Ecuador and Peru and in different places all around the world. It's very odd. And I sat with my friend, stop the ride, I want to get off. Santiago is a San Pedro shaman, and he told me about his ancestors building Machu Picchu, and he said, go to the hitching post of the sun, because it was built as an amplifier of intent. And whatever prayer you give there, the ancients would want it amplified. They used geometry and mathematics, and they understood ley lines and things like that. And just like Alan said, where do these people come up with this knowledge? We live alongside, with our skyscrapers and satellites. Aboriginal people don't even know we exist. 50, 100,000 years ago, the mystics will say, in the middle of the Atlantic, existed Atlantis, an advanced civilization that after it was destroyed, shared the knowledge and repromulgated society. So maybe that's the answer to the solution. Man bags. Graham Hancock first pointed this out for me, but I've been on this case for a while. So you have the crazy man bag that all these beings are carrying. Winged Anunnaki Sumerian guy has it. So what's with the wings? There's another man bag. It's just fascinating how many there are all around the world, right? And in Sumeria, this is a ziggurat of Ur. We have Plimpton 322 that was just analyzed. Alan, I don't know if he's here still, may appreciate this. So our research reveals that Plimpton 322, that cuneiform tablet, describes the shapes of right-angled triangles using a novel kind of trigonometry based on ratios, not angles and circles. Mansfield said it is a fascinating mathematical work that demonstrated undoubted genius. It's actually a new way to do trigonometry. It is off the charts, and it's been decoded. And where did these people come from? And this is the guy with the man bag who showed up and shared the arts of civilization and mathematics. That is in the Sumerian texts. It's just fascinating that level of mastery existed within the Sumerians. And they're like eagle people with four wings that are their gods, and they're all carrying the man bag. To me, this is like a really specific, just incredible coincidence. Fish Buddy has the man bag here, and these angel beings have the man bag. And there are man bags in museums all around the world, which is quite fascinating. And they're not just in the Middle East either. You find them at the Olmec site. And here you go, once again, the Mayan site. I don't know who this dude is, but he has a man bag. That's from central Mexico. This guy, 1800 BC from Colombia, he's got a man bag. This is kind of strange. Everybody thinks it's some kind of technology, but these beings, they're called the Atlantides, I think, in Hidalgo, in Mexico, I believe. They carry some kind of man bag. At the Bishop Stone in Ireland, this guy has a man bag. And Andrew and I are probably going to fight about this later. But I think these are man bags on Pillar 43. And we'll see when they excavate further if there are more specific ones. I think he thinks they're vulture boxes, and I don't know who's right until we build a time machine. But it's fascinating that Göbekli Tepe is starting to embody some of these things I'm talking about, androgynous creator gods. And I will get into that later in a private discussion with Andrew. I'm fascinated to figure it out. So this is my buddy Richard Cazzaro. He wrote a couple books, which I'll show you. But Viracocha, the androgynous creator god, is above the gate. He's embodying the God self icon, which is found all around the world, and I will show you that. It's really fascinating. So Bes, the Egyptian dwarf god, is also doing it on this doorway. And you find it in doorways all across the world here, not just in Peru. This God self icon, right? So what does it mean? It's the balance of opposites. It's the integration of the separate self with the higher self, the embodiment of our true spiritual nature. It is part of a lost religion of Atlantis. That's what the mystics would say. The correct good of all, oriented to the good of all, the understanding of the holographic nature of reality. And you find the specificity is really incredible. 2 snakes in each hand in Peru and Egypt, 1 snake in each hand in other places. If I had like 15 hours, I would keep hammering you away with this kind of stuff. And I don't want to do that. I hope I'm not bumming you out. But to me, it's so fascinating how much there is and how much symbolism is just entirely similar. And you find this all around the world. I just find it utterly fascinating, right? And this Babylonian winged being, he's doing it once again. And these man bags have these guys embodying the God self icon. And I talked to Richard. A lot of the beings like this guy are known to be androgynous. And he said, yes, I found that in my research too. I was just fascinated when I was in Peru. I kept looking at Viracocha. I'm like, who is this guy? It's like, if I was hooked up to a lie detector test, I'd say he's like this Atlantean advanced being who showed up after the flood. And I just got to, you start talking about, you drop the A word, it's like, this guy's out of his mind. But, I just feel compelled to share this. And I hope it, all resonated well. But if I just didn't put as much information in, I don't think the point would be made. Just the fascinating collection of disparate sources saying the same specific and bizarre thing about the past is extremely compelling. And I'm just a freak, I'm just going to continue to dig into this. And like I said, Hugh has a similar mind. And I'm really grateful for all of the researchers who've done the work. Somebody like Alan, right? Who's done this incredible amount of research, and he's really incontrovertibly, mathematically proven this thing, but it's dismissed because you're talking about a lost civilization. As simple as that. A perceptual shift can drag us to truth, right? Like right now, we could be experiencing different levels of existence coming in and out of our time frame here. Inflation theory and quantum mechanics are talking about multiverses, Let's have an open mind and let's use science the way it should be used in the service of spirit, in the service of something larger. And that's the problem. It's like male-dominated, left-brained. I'm sorry, you go to the doctor, and I'm grateful, but there's not this holistic approach to science. So I encourage everybody to, have a holistic approach, and I'm grateful that everybody here, has that. Oh God. Has that disposition. It's really heartening. I feel at home here. It's really a cool experience. So Liz's line is pretending to be a stuffed animal. I know I'm a weirdo. I used to have 17 cats. I took in a bunch of cats to care for them and gave them to our friends and stuff, so I really love cats. It's my Egyptian reincarnation. As you know, it's going to be really cool. And if you can go, I'd really recommend it. It's fascinating. Brian Forrester, he's brilliant. He's a really sweet guy. His wife, Irene, is really nice. Hugh, I grudgingly must say, is a brilliant researcher who knows everything about the Olmec, and I'm the guy who buy your beer. So that is it.
story of Atlantis has intrigued humanity for millennia. It has confounded the experts and brought wonderment to the general public. Ever since Plato described in great detail the history and demise of that Atlantean empire in his writings of Critias and Timaeus from around 400 BC. So if the story is real history, why and when did the Atlantean empire crumble? And why have we heard so few details about this dominant economic and military force of the ancient world? Were the ancient Atlanteans star mappers and earth mappers back in the Ice Age, as some historians suggest? Did Atlanteans have the capacity for space travel, and did they disappear through some vortex-like wormhole? Or were they destroyed by some galactic upheaval, as some mythologists suggest? Does the story of Atlantis even confirm some biblical accounts of the Book of Genesis? This documentary explores the newly discovered, down-to-earth findings of several offshore sites now considered to be a part of the ancient Atlantean Empire, and considers their implications for the timing of when Atlantis was consumed by the sea. These findings also show that this ancient civilization, founded by the legendary figure Atlas, must have had highly advanced and accurate mapping methods which enabled these Atlanteans to successfully measure and map the Earth, thereby allowing them the ability to navigate to far-flung locations throughout the world, representing an empire of global proportions that was wiped out at the end of the Ice Age.
Absolutely do think that the story of Atlantis fits into real history. And just to put that in context, if we look at what mainstream scholars regard as the recent history of the Earth, everybody is agreed that there was an event called the last Ice Age, and that the last Ice Age came to an end rather cataclysmically about 12,000 years ago. The story of Atlantis, if we go back to the original source of the story of Atlantis, the earliest surviving source that had come down to us is the Greek philosopher Plato. And Plato, who of course knew nothing about ice ages, nevertheless set the demise of Atlantis precisely at the time that the vast ice sheets that covered huge areas of the Earth were melting down and pouring their meltwater into the oceans and raising sea levels by 400 feet all around the world.
There are over 200 known sunken cities in the Mediterranean. And the idea that there's over 200 sunken cities in the Mediterranean is indicative that the whole Atlantic and the Mediterranean were flooded in some kind of catastrophe. These ruins are associated often with Atlantis. There's a certain type of polygonal megalithic construction that's very distinct. And you see this in these ruins that are still above water, but you see the same kind of construction in these underwater ruins too.
Here there are two dolmens. Menge is the biggest in the world. It's 5,000 years old and it's for the burial chamber too. We think that they buried 500 people inside of the dolmen of Menge. And the stone at the end, on top, is the biggest used in a prehistory monument from all the world too. The weight of this stone is 180 tons.
Megalithic building with gigantic sculpted stones is considered by almost all the experts to have begun around 2500 BC. From the Great Pyramid of Giza to Stonehenge in England to Baalbek of the ancient Canaanites, and even to the dolmens and citadels of southern Spain.
The dolmen of Pira, this is the dolmen of Pira. This dolmen is 4,500 years old, and it's for the burial chamber, like a tomb, prehistory tomb. In this dolmen you have two clearly different parts. The long corridor, and at the end it has a chamber for the burial. We think it's only for one person or one family, probably for the chief of the village that live here. And this is the only one of the three one of Antequera that is in the line of the summer solstice. One day of the year, the sunlight is coming through all the dolmen
the structures by the Romans. They were the base structures at Nibla, Ronda, and southern Spain, which were on rivers in the mountainous areas of the Sierra Morena Mountains, which is the richest mining area, the most ancient and richest mining area in the entire world. Now, this was a source of the wealth for the Atlanteans. They would bring this copper ore and tin ore and silver ore and gold ore down the rivers to Seville, and that was the Atlantean plain.
One form of megalithic construction that is found all over the world is known as Cyclopean. And Cyclopean construction is giant granite or some other stone boulders that have been shaped and are usually fitted together in a jigsaw pattern, where the stones are perfectly fitted and locked in together. We can find it in Spain, we can find it in Greece, in Turkey, in the Middle East. We can even find it in Mexico and other areas. And the similarity of this unusual type of construction, in my mind, is evidence of a singular source for this construction method, and I believe that is Atlantis.
So off the coast of southern Spain are submerged megaliths in at least 5 sites. Off of Lixus, Morocco, west of Gibraltar. Off of Tarifa, which is right near Gibraltar. Off of Huelva, Rota, and Chipiona. Submerged megaliths in 50 to 100 feet of water, which are of the megalithic, well-hewn rock forms, walls, citadels, paving stones for streets, the whole bit. Discovered at these 4 locations offshore. Submerged when the Ice Age ended.
The capital city of Atlantis was a canal city with concentric canals and rings leading in to an inner city and port area. And Plato describes the city of Atlantis very specifically this way. The city of Carthage, built in Tunisia by the Phoenicians, was in many ways a miniature model of the capital city of Atlantis, with also these concentric circles and canals leading to an inner city. In many ways, Carthage was a rebuilding of the ancient capital of Atlantis.
Carthage, in the ancient language, was pronounced Kart-Hadash, and that means
earliest surviving source that had come down was the philosopher Plato. And Plato, of course, knew nothing about ice ages, nevertheless set the demise of Atlantis precisely at the time that the vast ice sheets that covered huge areas of the earth were melting down and pouring their meltwater into the oceans and raising sea levels by 400 feet all around the world.
There are over 200 known sunken cities in the Mediterranean. And the idea that there's over 200 sunken cities in the Mediterranean is indicative that the whole Atlantic and the Mediterranean were flooded in some kind of catastrophe. These ruins are associated often with Atlantis. There's a certain type of polygonal megalithic construction that's very distinct. And you see this in these ruins that are still above water, but you see the same kind of construction in these underwater ruins too.
Here there are 2 dolmens. Mengele is the biggest in the world. It's 5,000 years old and it's for the burial chamber too. We think that they buried 500 people inside of the dolmen of Mengele. And the stone at the end, on top, is the biggest used in a prehistory monument from all the world too. The weight of this stone is 180 tons.
Megalithic building with gigantic sculpted stones is considered by almost all the experts to have begun around 2500 BC. From the Great Pyramid of Giza to Stonehenge in England to Baalbek of the ancient Canaanites and even to the dolmens and citadels of southern Spain.
The dolmen of Viera, this is the dolmen of Viera. This dolmen is 4,500 years old, and it's for the burial chamber, like a tomb, prehistory tomb. In this dolmen you have two clearly different parts. The long corridor, and at the end it has the chamber for the burial. Within is only for one person or one family, probably for the chief of the village that live here. And this is the only one of the 3 of Antequera that is in the line of the summer solstice. One day of the year, the sunlight is coming through all the dolmen until the end of the chamber, 23rd of June.
All across the southern plain of Spain are these megalithic dolmens, Hormazo buildings, and they are at the base of what later would be built upon the structures by the Romans. They were the base structures at Nibla, Ronda, in southern Spain, which were on rivers in the mountainous areas of the Sierra Morena Mountains, which is the richest mining area, the most ancient and richest mining area in the entire world. Now, this was a source of the wealth for the Atlanteans. They would bring this copper ore and tin ore and silver ore and gold ore down the rivers to Seville, and that was the Atlantean plain.
One form of megalithic construction that is found all over the world is known as Cyclopean. And Cyclopean construction is giant granite or some other stone boulders that have been shaped and are usually fitted together in a jigsaw pattern, where the stones are perfectly fitted and locked in together. We can find it in Spain, we can find it in Greece, in Turkey, in the Middle East. We can even find it in Mexico and other areas. And the similarity of this unusual type of construction, in my mind, is evidence of a singular source for this construction method, and I believe that is Atlantis.
So off the coast of southern Spain are submerged megaliths in like at least 5 sites. Off of Lixus, Morocco, west of Gibraltar. Off of Tarifa, which is right near Gibraltar. Off of Huelva, Rota, and Chipiona. Submerged megaliths in 50 to 100 feet of water, which are of the megalithic, well-hewn rock forms, walls, citadels, paving stones for streets, the whole bit. Discovered at these 4 locations offshore. Submerged when the Ice Age ended.
The capital city of Atlantis was a canal city with concentric canals and rings leading in to an inner city and port area. And Plato describes the city of Atlantis very specifically this way. The city of Carthage, built in Tunisia by the Phoenicians, was in many ways a miniature model of the capital city of Atlantis, with also these concentric circles and canals leading to an inner city. In many ways, Carthage was a rebuilding of the ancient capital of Atlantis.
Carthage, in the ancient language, is pronounced Kart-Hadash, and that means new city. So it was a copy of the old city, Atlantis, somewhere near in the Gibraltar area. It was a direct copy of Atlantis. Now, the common thought process is that Atlantis went under about 10,000 years ago, and that Carthage was built around 1000 BC. So the ancients waited 9,000 years to make the new city, the replica, the copy of Atlantis. They waited 8,000, 9,000 years to do that, to replicate it. Seems very doubtful to me.
Another thing that a lot of your Atlantean researchers will point to is the cross of Atlantis as the symbol of Atlantis, derived from Plato's description of the central city of Atlantis. The cross of Atlantis shows 3 concentric rings with a cross in the center with a canal emerging from the cross. And this is, again, thought to be a description of the central city of Atlantis. But what I've noticed is that when you look at the cross of Atlantis with the 2-dimensional image of the concentric rings, symbolically, a 2-dimensional image of the concentric rings represents a 3-dimensional experience. The 2D concentric rings represents a 3-dimensional vortex. And nobody seems to talk about Atlantis as being a vortex or a gateway that leads into other realms. But that's exactly what I think it was.
I believe that Atlantis was a maritime civilization, and I believe it was based on coastlines and that it was globally distributed. I think it was all over the world. I think it was virtually everywhere, but it was on coastlines. And the reason that so little evidence that historians would accept have come down to us is because those coastlines were all submerged and are now under 100 feet of water since the end of the last ice age, and nobody has looked there. So I think actually the influence of a great lost civilization is to be found all around the world. And I think one of the places in which it was very active was in the Mediterranean and in the eastern side of what we now call the Atlantic Ocean.
If I were looking for Atlantis, again, although I've spent my life doing that, I would make a beeline for Spain. And I would go toward Gibraltar and Tangier in Africa, because that's where Plato said Atlantis was. Anyone who reads Plato's dialogues knows that Atlantis is beyond the gates of Hercules, one of which is Gibraltar, one of which is Tangier.
The extent of Atlantis, as described by Plato, is outside and inside the Pillars of Hercules. So that obviously is not just an island. It was a coastline. Plato said that it extended from the Gibraltar east all the way to the Tyrrhenian Sea, which is Italy, and to Libya, and to the west, outside of the Pillars of Hercules, along the coastlines, all along northwest Africa, as well as southwestern Spain. So it was not just an island. The main city of Poseidon was submerged, and it may be one of these three now off the coast of southern Spain, at Tarifa, Huelva, Chipiona, and Rota.
These Atlanteans were savvy ancient mappers whose leader, the legendary Atlas, has always been associated with sophisticated mapping. Atlas and his fleets were well known in the ancient world as successful navigators and mappers of vast expanses of oceans and their coastlines for trade and military conquest. They used a little-known ancient method with which they could sail away and successfully find their way back to their base ports, presumably in the Gibraltar area near the Atlas Mountains of Morocco and the rich mining districts of southern Spain.
You go to Egypt and you go to the so-called Solar Boat Museum. Here's a boat built for Khufu, supposedly built at the Great Pyramid, 2500 BC. It's as advanced as anything up to and maybe even including the clipper ships. This boat could go anywhere, and if people had knowledge of the stars, and it is now becoming quite clear that they did have knowledge of the stars. So if they knew navigation, in a boat of this sort, you could get anywhere. America, Australia, any place.
The earliest ocean-going ships, such as Khufu's ship, were built in this time frame when Old Kingdom Egypt began to flourish, around 2500 BC. The Phoenicians of Canaan, world-renowned navigators, were also beginning to build their ships at this time. Even the ancient Greeks began to build huge trireme ships mentioned by Plato in his epic account of the warfare between the Atlanteans and the Greeks, the dominant maritime empires at this time. These ancient shipbuilding civilizations are now considered to have easily been able to navigate and exploit the lands on both sides of the Atlantic, with guidance from Atlas's mapping method.
According to the ancient Aztec legends, the original homeland of the Aztecs was a mysterious and lost land called Atlan. And the word Atlan is in fact part of the word Atlantis. So the idea too that the Aztecs' mysterious homeland that they left was somehow in Spain, off the coast of Spain, perhaps even the Basque areas of Spain, I think is a theory that deserves some thinking about.
Whenever the archaeologists get to work digging up ancient ruins, very often it's something, for example, the Mayan temples. As they keep digging, they find that, okay, the current temples are built, let's say, 800, 900 AD, but they dig down deeper and deeper and they're finding things 2000, 3000 BC.
3000 BC, megalithic cyclopean structures. The Dutch in that area of Western Europe call a submerged lost civilization in their lore Atlant. So we see this term ATL, Atlantic, Atlant, from the Mayans all the way across to Europe. So it seems to be a common seafaring culture at around 2000 BC.
Yes, this is a very interesting point, is the references that we find from Central America to a place called Atlant, which seemed to be the home civilization from which the later historical civilization of Central America sprang. It's impossible to resist the connection between those references to a lost land called Atlant and to Plato's notion of Atlantis.
And then there's the work of Barry Fell back in the 70s America BC that makes it quite clear, at least back as far as the Phoenicians, but maybe further back than that, they were routinely visiting the New World. Again, in academia, that I often like to call quackademia, this is considered illegitimate to even suggest that these ancient people were capable of intercourse with each other in terms of trade or commerce or whatever.
These ancient ruins of southern Mexico, later built upon by the Mayans, were cyclopean megalithic structures and are strikingly similar to those ancient structures of Lixus on the Atlantic coast of Morocco, as well as those of southern Spain, the region generally considered to have been the home base of the Atlantean Empire. This region includes the Basque country of Spain, whose people not only claim a lineage from the Atlanteans, but also refer to their lost kingdom as Atlantica.
It's interesting, too, along those lines, that the Basque language, which is very unique, is also a very similar language to the Aztec language known as Nahuatl. Both the Basque language and the Aztec language has a very curious combination of X sounds and ATL sounds, otl, quatl, kukakl. So when you have this Aztec language and the Basque language compared, you find a lot of curious similarities.
The suffix atl, spelled ATL, found at the end of some Mexican words, means water, and the ancient Mexican homeland is said to have been Atlan, across the water to the eastern Atlantic. So the connection to an Atlantean civilization is unavoidable. These Atlanteans quite obviously had the navigating savvy to get the job done, with a little-known ancient mapping method which allowed the surprisingly accurate mapping of many parts of the world in ancient times, even during the Ice Age.
And very interestingly, there's a whole category of maps produced between the 15th and the 17th century based on lost sources, which show the world with astonishing accuracy as it looked during the last Ice Age. I'll give you an example of this. Off the west coast of Ireland, you can find on maps from the 15th century a little circular island appears, which they call High Brazil. Such an island did not exist in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries of our era. But if you reconstruct the coastlines of the world as they looked when sea level was much lower, as it was during the last Ice Age, you find that an island was exposed above sea level in exactly the place that is indicated on those maps. How did they know it was there unless somebody was there to map it?
These Sea King maps show accurate east-west distances, and that requires a knowledge, an accurate knowledge of time. You have to measure time to get that. Now, they didn't have clocks back then. They didn't have timepieces at 2000, 3000 BC, so they had to have another mechanism by which they could measure time. And that mechanism is the slow wobble of the Earth's axis, which would cycle once in 25,920 years. And with this rate of the wobble of the Earth's axis, the constellations of the zodiac appear to move along the horizon. They knew this rate, therefore they could measure time and therefore measure east-west distances.
For example, in Western times, the longitude was only developed and discovered, or let's say, made precise some understanding of those measures is what gives rise to the ancient measuring system of cubits, and this is, again, universal.
Well, the references to units of measurement is the measurement that is expressed in the Great Pyramid. I think actually that the ancient Egyptian cubit is likely to turn out to be what is called an earth commensurate measure, that it is derived from an ancient system of measurement based on the knowledge of the dimensions of the Earth.
The circumference of the Earth is 21,600 nautical miles. And the base perimeter length of the Great Pyramid is half a nautical mile. So the circumference of the Earth is 43,200 base perimeter lengths. So it's an Earth commensurate measurement. And the royal cubit was derived by subdividing that half nautical mile. Now, the base perimeter of the Great Pyramid is 440 royal cubits per base side. There's 4 sides, so multiply 440 by 4, and you get 1,760. Now, you divide 1,760 into half a nautical mile, and you get your 20.632 inches. So it's an Earth commensurate measurement.
There's no doubt whatsoever that the Great Pyramid of Egypt does embody the dimensions of the Earth. If you take the measurement of the base perimeter of the Great Pyramid, go along and measure each of its 4 sides and add that together, and then you multiply that number by 43,200, you will get a very accurate rendition of the equatorial circumference of the Earth to within a few miles of the value that we have today. If you take the height of the Great Pyramid and multiply it by the same number, 43,200, you will get a very accurate rendition of the polar radius of the Earth, in other words, of the distance from the center of the Earth to the North Pole. Now this is really quite remarkable.
The Earth and night sky were viewed as a sphere within a sphere by several ancient civilizations. In the ancient book of the Mexicans, the Popol Vuh, it is written that the ancients could measure the round face of the Earth and the arch of the sky. Even Plato referred to the Earth as a sphere within the celestial sphere. As a result of the slow wobble of the Earth's axis, the sphere of the night sky appears to move at a constant rate of 72 years per 1 degree, known as precession. These Atlantean star mappers were apparently able to predict where on Earth the constellations of the night sky would appear at the same position, relative to the horizon. So, with this knowledge, the ancients related time to distance, the same principle upon which is based our modern nautical mile system, with arc minutes and arc seconds.
The notion of the knowledge of precession of the equinox, that's another matter that's becoming better and better established almost by the day. The ancients knew about the precession of the equinox way back when and right into their legends and mythology.
Precession of the equinox is also known as lunisolar precession. It is the gravitational pull of the moon and the sun on the Earth's equator, causing a wobble with the falling tropic. I think that they were able to measure the rate of precession of the instrument without being discovered. And so, yes, I do think so. And I think that they created what was known as the Great Pyramid, which is in the one roll of the precession, if you like, one orbit of the precession. And that they broke them down into 12, as long as the zodiac signs, in which they were 2,160 years long.
It appears that the ancients did have a method of understanding the Earth in a different way than we do today. Like a good example is Plato remarked that if you could see the true Earth from afar, it would appear as a 12-angle pyramid, as a 12-patched leather ball is the way he described it. And so you can get this picture that they had this incredible consciousness. They had a highly advanced degree of consciousness that was not Earth-based. Much of their knowledge was based upon a viewpoint of the Earth, looking at it from the outside in.
Some have said that extraterrestrials had to have given the ancients the knowledge that the Earth is round, that the Earth is a sphere, but ancient religions complete that the Earth is round. a sphere. No need for extraterrestrials to be passing this knowledge down to the ancients.
The duration of the 12 zodiac ages, 2,160 years each, is 1/12 of the amount of time that it would take for the Earth to wobble once as it spins and revolves around the Sun, totaling 25,920 years. So the ancients, including the Egyptians and Atlanteans, were clearly able to measure the Earth by measuring the apparent movement of the constellations across the night sky. Recent research by several authorities has also revealed that the Earth's dimensions are embodied in the dimensions of the Great Pyramid of Giza, which experts now consider was used as the ancient prime meridian, as indicated on several ancient maps.
Certainly on the instrument that I've got that I can show to you, there's 3 arc minutes. And 3 arc minutes would allow anybody observing the precession of the equinoxes to figure out the rate of movement within a period of 9 years of observation.
Accuracy of 3 arc minutes is accuracy to within 0.5%. This level of accuracy is, not coincidentally, the same level of accuracy achieved in surveying the half-nautical mile-based perimeter length of the Great Pyramid of Giza. These structural measurements of the Great Pyramid is an almost perfect reduction of the dimensions of the Earth by a factor of 43,200. The Great Pyramid was almost certainly the embodiment of this very precise ancient precession mapping technique, and it was the base reference point for mapping the ancient world. Today, Greenwich, England is the base reference point for timekeeping, and also nautical mile measurement, which is based upon the relationship of time to distance, as was the ancient system based at Giza in Egypt that was derived from precession timekeeping.
I think there is evidence really from the Dead Sea Scrolls as the Assyrians measured the lunar calendar. If you go back to Egypt, then obviously we're talking about Thoth, Thoth meaning wisdom. And he was also god of the moon. So we can see that he involved himself in weights and measures and writing and language and all of those things, and also says he involved himself in the moon. So measurement of the moon is the only body in the sky that's retrograde at a rate that's measurable by the eye.
Plato says that Atlantis went under 9,000 years before his time, which would put it around 10,000 BC. However, in the ancient world, the lunar calendar was very popular. The lunar calendar was their day-to-day calendar. Now, Plato received this story about Atlantis through 4 layers of oral renderings, initially from Egypt. So during those 4 renderings, the translation could have been lost. Did they mean lunar calendar or solar calendar? Now, the evidence does fit the lunar calendar rendering 9,000 lunar cycles before his time, which would put the Atlantis within historical times. So this, to me, makes much more sense.
Also, to navigate the world, they had incredible knowledge of the stars, of geography. In 1902, they found in a Greek shipwreck a device called the Antikythera mechanism. And today it is in the Archaeological Museum in Athens, Greece. It was years of study that they found that this device had cog wheels with hundreds of interconnected machines, and it was a very intricate device, literally a computer that dialed up the stars and was used for very sophisticated navigation.
This Antikythera mechanism had many bronze gears, which replicated the various cycles of the sun, moon, planets, and stars in their cohesive movements. Therefore, this device could realistically predict their future positions. This mechanism had 2 concentric scales on the front, one for the Greek solar cycle and the other for the Egyptian lunar-based Sothic cycle. It is therefore altogether possible that the solar or lunar cycles of Plato's 9,000 so-called years back to Atlantis could have been confused before the story even got to Plato. Also, Also, according to Plato's accounts, the Greek kings Erechtheus, Cecrops, and Erecthonius ruled at roughly the same time as the destruction of Atlantis. These kings are commonly thought by historians of ancient Greece to have ruled around 1500 BC, certainly not 10,000 BC. So 9,000 lunar cycles before Plato's time more logically fits the timeline of his accounts, while 9,000 solar cycles does not.
I don't think that Plato made anything up. I take Plato extremely seriously, and I think since our historians take Plato seriously in almost everything else he says, we ought to take him seriously on the issue of Atlantis. And if you take apart what Plato is saying, he's talking about a great global civilization which had a strong influence in the Mediterranean area. Plato didn't know about the Ice Age, but he did know that a great flood took place at that time. To my mind, that adds a great deal of credibility to everything that he said.
With the conventional date proposed by mainstream scientists for the end of the Ice Age at 10,000 BC, Greece would have been about 8,000 years away from the reigns of these three kings, and huge trireme ships of the Atlantis story appear 8,000 years later, at around 2000 BC. These conflicts in Plato's accounts cannot be resolved satisfactorily by mainstream academicians, and such conflicts and dating cannot explain the cyclopean megalithic structures that were submerged at the end of the Ice Age. Plato's descriptions of the Atlantean Empire were so detailed that they are reflected even in biblical references. Southern Spain is also called the Hesperides. They were daughters of Atlas and granddaughters of Poseidon, Atlas's father. As Poseidon means father Sidon, and as Sidon was a son of Canaan, we see that the Atlantean people first came from the eastern Mediterranean, from the land of Canaan, a port city of which was Sidon. Cadiz, a city in southern Spain where an offshore site was located, was named after another son of Poseidon, Gadez. So the tie-in of these so-called mythological Atlantean characters with biblical accounts is now becoming apparent to ancient historians.
Southern Spain is known as the Hesperides. They were daughters of Atlas, a supposedly mythological figure, but Atlas was the man of maps. He was this precession measurer who measured and mapped the earth, among others with him, the Atlanteans. And their base of operations was Tarshish, the biblical Tarshish. The Spaniards today know that Seville, which was anciently known as Tartessos, previous to that was known as Tharsin, or Tharsis. That's the Tarshish of the Bible, the great merchants of southern Spain. This area also known as the Hesperides. These were the Phoenicians, the same as the Atlanteans, circa 2000 BC.
Phoenician sailors were under pain of death to keep the trade routes secret, particularly the trade routes that went out into the Atlantic. Their trade routes went to Spain, up to France, and to Cornwall, where the tin and copper trade was flourishing. What the Phoenicians did was try to keep their trade routes a secret, and so they fostered these ideas that the Atlantic was impassable to other ships, so that only their ships would have the courage and the knowledge to go beyond the Straits of Hercules into the Atlantic.
Plato also elaborates on the gold, copper, silver, and tin mines of the Sierra Morena Mountains of southern Spain, which were by far the richest in the ancient world. It is presumed that they were the lifeblood of the Atlantean shipping empire with its mineral wealth, and these Atlanteans clearly had the ability to transport these minerals to the eastern Mediterranean to trade with the Greeks, Minoans, Canaanites, and Egyptians. So it would seem that the Atlanteans of about 2000 BC were truly the dominant shipping and military power in the western Mediterranean and eastern Atlantic. Their empire most likely ranged from Gibraltar in the west, northward to the rich tin mines of Cornwall, England, where are found the now submerged sites referred to as Avalon, and eastward from Gibraltar to as far as Italy and Libya. The almost Identical cyclopean megalithic ruins found in those regions, both onshore and now submerged, support and confirm Plato's account.
I feel that what actually happened was that these people had a land which was bounded by the sea as opposed to bounded by the land. And they followed the trade routes, trade wind routes as we know them today, and the local Atlantic currents, and they travelled around the basin of the Atlantic Ocean. And so they existed on the peripheries of France, of Britain, of Scandinavia, and then down the coasts of Spain, around the north coast of Africa, across from Cape Verde Islands to Canaries, to the northern parts of America, Caribbean, and back around the route again up from Newfoundland.
As evidenced by the submerged megalithic ruins found in various parts of the world, some of which are on the shallow seafloor of the Gibraltar region, off Spain at Tarifa, Chipiona, Rota, Huelva, as well as off Lixus, Morocco, it is only now becoming clear that the tremendous sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age consumed the coastline portions of these ancient civilizations, preeminent among them being these simple structures of the Atlantean Empire.
Okay.
One of the mysteries of ancient Egypt is the invasion of the sea peoples who fought major naval battles with the Egyptians during the New Kingdom. Who these sea people were, where they came from, is one of the great mysteries of history. It would seem that the sea peoples, in fact, came out of Northern Europe. They were coming out of Denmark, Northern Germany, areas of Holland that were to go underwater.
These sea people apparently began to migrate from their homelands along the shores of the eastern Atlantic and the western Mediterranean at a time that would coincide with the end of the Ice Age. Their own ports and coastal cities were being submerged when many experts now claim that the sea level rose at a rate of 3 feet per year for about 100 years, and tsunamis from the volcanic eruptions of Mount Etna and Santorini were surging onto the disappearing coastlines.
These areas of the world were being flooded, and the sea peoples themselves then migrated in boats through the straits of the Hercules into the Mediterranean, where they battled the Egyptians, and the Egyptians won that battle and defeated the sea peoples. This is a major turning point in Egyptian history. And the sea peoples then settled near to Egypt, but more around Greece, Turkey, and Lebanon.
Even Egypt was affected by the end of the Ice Age. Where are the submerged megalithic ruins of the ancient Egyptian port cities known as Heraklion and Meneuthus near Alexandria? Meneuthus, the namesake of that now submerged Egyptian megalithic city, was another son of Poseidon, as reported by Plato. According to ancient biblical legend, Sidon, known as Poseidon, which means Father Sidon, a son of Canaan, and his progeny, Atlas and Meneuthus among them, were building port cities from Sidon, Canaan, across the coast of North Africa, and all the way to Gibraltar and beyond. They were building their maritime trade empire with the ancient mapping knowledge of Atlas, the map man, who could measure and thereby map the earth with the dimensions of the Great Pyramid of Giza being the reduced embodiment of the dimensions of the earth.
There are a number of scholars who contended that the Great Pyramid is a scale model of the earth.
Not my phone.
And
I have my phone.
most of those is agreed.
I have my phone.
Herodotus or Agathocrates, one of the ancient Greeks who mentioned that because it was that had Isaac Newton send his colleague John Greaves down to Egypt to try and figure out if there was anything to that old legend.
The base perimeter length of the Great Pyramid is almost precisely 1/2 a nautical mile, which is a reduction of the perimeter length of the Earth by a factor of 43,200, clearly indicating that the ancient Egyptians built the pyramid with that connection in mind. The dimensions of the Earth can only be measured by measuring time, which allows the measurement of longitudes, which are measurements of east-west distances. Because the ancient Egyptians didn't have accurate clocks to measure east-west distances, they needed a different timekeeping standard, which they apparently identified as the rate of the movement of the constellations along the horizon resulting from the slow wobble of the Earth's axis.
And then you see the rate of the precession of the equinox of 25,920. All of these simple things show that these people were measuring the size of their horizon, if you like, meaning time zone, related to themselves and to the stars as an exponential form of measurement. It's just a matter of rolling a wheel and converting the distance of a circumference into a straight line. It's very interesting, in truth, the Great Pyramid, because I can teach a child how to design a Great Pyramid instantly with the cross. Well, within 3 minutes, let's be fair, if a child of 5 can produce a perfect pyramid every time with simple geometry.
By triangulating where the constellations would appear in the future, according to their measured apparent rate of movement of 72 years per 1 degree, the ancients could pinpoint their location anywhere on Earth to within a 0.5% accuracy. So many distinct cultures and civilizations from different parts of the world integrated precession mapping numbers such as 12, 36, 54, 72, 108, and 432 into their respective ancient legends and architectures, indicating the scope of their knowledge and understanding of the Earth and stars.
The Hindus, the Chinese, everybody had accurate and very advanced measuring systems based upon knowledge of the dimensions of the Earth. This is now quite formal. The evidence over the course of a number of books by various scholars, many of them independent of each other, pretty well this was known on the side of academia, because if they know longitude, it means that they have an advanced and sophisticated science at their fingertips.
Some of the maps of the Ice Age Sea Kings show mapping reference points radiating from the area of the Upper Nile Delta, where the Great Pyramid is located. This indicates that the ancient prime meridian, the base reference point for the ancient navigators, extended through the location of the Great Pyramid of Giza. So it would seem that the Egyptians were not only master builders, but also adept navigators, like the Canaanite Phoenicians, some of whom were the Atlanteans.
The maps themselves testify to an ancient project to completely map the whole world. In order to map the whole world, you need big ships, which are capable of enormous journeys to actually visit all of these places around the world. These maps show the world in great detail as it looked during the last ice age, not in the Middle Ages. And these maps incorporate extremely accurate longitude relationships.
In the Middle Ages, a number of maps did exist of the Atlantic, and they often showed across the Atlantic a mysterious land known as Antilla, or the Antilles. And this area was associated with Atlantis. St. Brendan, other seafarers were known to go out into the Atlantic in search of this mysterious island of the Antilles. Later, historians and cartographers identified the Antilles with many of the Caribbean islands. And in fact, they're called the Antilles today.
The Greek philosopher Aristotle called the Phoenicians the Antilhas, who called themselves the Cana Anu, which means offspring of Canaan. So, according to the biblical timeline, these ancient world navigators were operating as the Atlantean Empire during the Ice Age, which, according to conventional ancient historians, ended around 10,000 BC, but which now appears to have ended closer to 1,500 BC. This time frame also coincides with the exodus of the Hebrews out of Egypt, when the sea level was rising due to the melting of Ice Age ice packs, and the Middle East, Egypt, and the Indus Valley of India were drying out with the end of the Ice Age, causing the mass migration of people groups. Among them, the Sea People, who were the displaced Atlanteans as their civilization was being destroyed.
The way the technology, the Atlantean technology was lost is inferred by Plato. And he describes how they had a divine essence within them, and that over time this divine essence diminished. And when Zeus heard about this from his home in the center of the universe, as Plato describes, he sent his wrath. But if we extrapolate from that story and assume that even the center of the universe, by that he meant the center of the Milky Way galaxy, we do know that periodically galaxies go into what are called their active galactic nucleus phase, where they sprout out just these incredible
Let's get the shit out of them. Let's get the shit out of them.
Almost all would agree that Atlantis did succumb to the sea because of the end of the Ice Age, when the polar ice caps melted and the water poured into the sea, rapidly raising sea level and submerging all these megalithic structures, which are now on the shallow seafloor. It's not because of some heat pulse from outer space, it's because the oceans had cooled to the point where that evaporation was not so great, so the dense cloud cover was no more, so the Ice Age ended, sea level rose. That's hydrology 101. Paradoxically, warmer ocean waters is the only way you can explain the dense cloud cover for the Ice Age.
So, were there really 8,000 years of missing history between the time that mainstream historians say the Ice Age ended at 10,000 BC and when they say this sophisticated megalithic building began on shore and presumably offshore as well at around 2000 BC? If so, what was going on during those 8,000 years? And why did the ancients wait 8,000 years before resuming their megalithic building and advanced navigation of the earth?
Particularly as we discover more and more megalithic cities underwater, we're amassing better proof ancient civilization will call Atlantis. These cities just were not built underwater. They had to be built before these oceanic level changes. So whenever that was, that is, at least how ancient we can start to date these cities, and that is putting us back into this time frame of Atlantis.
Plato, a world-renowned scholar, people look to him as a source of truth and knowledge. Now, was Plato misinformed when he was told 9,000?
I need another charger. Is there one in the kitchen?
Atlantis to have gone under? Apparently so, because
Shorter wire.
evidence, it could not have been back at that time frame. So apparently he was misinformed. He should have written 9,000 lunar cycles before his time. Therefore, he would not appear to be misinformed as badly as he is with this 9,000 solar years before his time's rendition that Atlantis went under. So we gotta look hard at lunar cycles, and with that, Plato looks like the legitimate, fantastic scholar that he should rightfully be.
The submerged megalithic ruins of the Gibraltar area, as well as those off Egypt, Lebanon, Greece, India, and Japan, should be more fully investigated. But clearly, mainstream scientists and historians have shown a reluctance to do so because they would have to rewrite their chronology of ancient history. These offshore sites were obviously the port cities of the ancient Atlantean civilization, which clearly flourished during the Ice Age, whose navigators measured and thereby mapped the Earth with astonishing accuracy, using the precession mapping methods used by Atlas, the founder of the legendary and truly historical maritime empire of Atlantis.
Sorry.
Inside of it,
is an historian who spent 20 years studying the lost world of the Incas. He believes he's found in the Spanish chronicles of the conquest of Peru a code, and broken it. A code that might even connect the Incas with the builders of the pyramids and of Stonehenge. And with this code, he believes he's unfolded a secret history of the Inca Empire. A secret history which reveals not only why the greatest empire of the Americas was created, and why it collapsed, but even why the Incas sacrificed their children. Bill Sullivan believes the Incas left us these secrets as a message in a bottle, because they wanted someone in the future to tell the story of who they were and what they'd achieved. 2 years ago, on a trip to the Andes, Bill found concrete confirmation of his ideas. Fernando Elorieta, unlike most Inca experts, grew up here in the heart of the sacred valley of the Incas. Inca myths and legends were part of his childhood. Fernando, like Bill, was aware that the Incas were infatuated with astronomy. Bill's idea that Inca gods were planets and that the black clouds visible in the Milky Way were the Incas' constellations fitted in with everything he knew. He'd spent 20 years searching in the sacred valley, following clues in the myths, and believed he had the visible proof Bill needed.
I was amazed when I saw Fernando's book, because I had assumed until that moment that the mental world of the Incas that I'd been exploring through the mythology, that its major manifestation was in the myths. When I found Fernando's work, I saw immediately that the entire mental map of the Inca world is laid out in the sacred valley. He began to explain to me that the animals, which are represented as black clouds in the Milky Way, actually exist in the valley in the form of huge effigies carved by means of agricultural terraces into the mountainside. So that the entire sacred valley is a reflection of the Milky Way and the constellations in it.
Hay muchas constelaciones representadas en el valle y otras que tal vez todavía no las comprendemos.
There are many constellations represented in the valley, and maybe others which we still haven't found, hidden among the mountains. One day we'll manage to reveal all that the valley contains. So far we found images of the constellations, the condor, toad, llama, tree and the serpent. They're all along the valley.
Están a lo largo del valle.
Constellations for the Incas were the dark patches within the Milky Way. Inca astronomy focused on the Milky Way because, unlike us, they could see its full glory. What Fernando explained to Bill was that people hadn't seen the Milky Way effigies for centuries because they weren't meant for just anybody. The whole idea was to create imagery that was reserved for the initiated who knew how to see it, just like their myths. Fernando told Bill how to look at the land and sent him to the road above the town of Pisac, where, he told him, he'd find a giant effigy of a condor.
The condor was another of the black cloud constellations in the Milky Way. And